The worn clogs made no sound on the tile. Margaret Walsh had learned that years ago, how to move through a hospital corridor without announcing herself, without drawing the eye of anyone who might look close enough to see what she'd been. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song overhead as she pushed through the double doors of Oak Creek Memorial's cardiac unit at 6:47 in the morning, her graying hair pulled back in a neat bun so tight it pulled the skin at her temples, her scrubs faded from 3 years of countless washings. She didn't flinch at the antiseptic smell mixing with stale coffee from the break room. Didn't flinch at anything anymore. She had spent 5 years training herself not to flinch. The locker at the end of the nurse's station was hers, a dented grey metal box with a broken lock that didn't matter because no one had anything worth stealing from Margaret Walsh. She opened it and there sat her lunch in a reusable container, her spare badge on a lanyard, and beneath them, folded into a careful rectangle, a navy jacket with the stitching coming loose at one shoulder. The faded Kandahar unit patch was sewn inside the lining, hidden where only her hands would ever find it. She let her fingers brush the embroidered border, just for a second, just enough to feel it was still there, then pushed the jacket deeper into the locker and closed the door. It was 6:51 a.m. She had 9 minutes before she was due on the floor. The ICU cardiac unit at Oak Creek Memorial ran with the precision of a well-oiled machine, or at least that's what the administration liked to claim in their quarterly meetings. 16 beds, 4 nurse stations, a medication dispensary that required 3 separate password entries, and a rhythm that Margaret had learned to navigate without disrupting. She moved between the beds in the pre-dawn darkness, checking monitors and 4 lines, her hand steady as surgical steel even as her left hand tremored slightly in her lap during her shift breaks, a reminder she worked hard to ignore, the kind of thing that happened when someone had gripped a tourniquet too tight for too long, applying pressure to save someone's life while mortar rounds sang overhead. Pain is data. Pain is information. The old mantras came to her less often now. By 7:15 a.m., the unit was waking. A resident named Chen came through, checking on the overnight admissions, and Margaret handed him the electronic chart for bed 4 without being asked. She'd already prepared it the way she knew he liked it, organized, cross-referenced, the way someone who'd run trauma units in field hospitals understood the way busy doctors needed information to move at speed. Chen nodded at her without looking up, the kind of acknowledgement that asked nothing and gave nothing. That was the bargain Margaret had made with silence. The nurses called her Walsh. Not Margaret. Not Maggie. Just Walsh. There was no warmth in it and no malice either, which suited her perfectly. She was competent. She was reliable. She was forgettable. She was invisible. That was the point. It wasn't until 8:40 a.m. that she noticed the younger man watching her. His name was Jake Torres, and he was on his first rotation in a civilian hospital after leaving active duty as a combat medic with the 75th Ranger Regiment, 3 years of combat medicine in environments where you didn't have ventilators or blood warmers or the luxury of calling a code. He'd transferred to Denver General for a rotation, but Oak Creek Memorial had picked him up for per diem work because the city needed people who understood trauma. Margaret noticed him because he moved the way people moved when they'd learned that hesitation could kill you. Be economical, purposeful, aware of every angle in the room. She was preparing a surgical tray for a procedure on bed 7, her movements efficient and precise, muscle memory taking over the way it always did when her hands had work to do. Gather the supplies. Check the sterility seals. Arrange them in the order they would be needed. It was a rhythm she could do in her sleep because she'd done it 10,000 times, the last 3,000 of them in places where the electricity was powered by generators and the closest operating room was 8 kilometers away through terrain that wanted to kill you. Torres watched her arrange the instruments, his eyes narrowing slightly. She felt the weight of his attention the way you felt attention when someone had learned to read small details, the way she positioned the tray, the order of the instruments, the muscle memory in her forearms that didn't match the faded scrubs and the graying hair. "That's a good setup," he said, his voice carrying the flat tone of someone who'd spent time around military people and had picked up the habit of speaking without flourish. Most of the civilian nurses, they arrange them by category. You're arranging them by sequence. Margaret didn't look up from the tray. It's faster. It's the way field medics set up for procedures under pressure. He paused. His eyes were doing something then, searching her face for confirmation. "You military?" "I'm a nurse," she said, her voice measured, the way she'd trained it to be. Low enough not to carry, steady enough not to shake. The voice of someone who'd decided a long time ago not to take up space. "The setup just works better this way." Torres nodded and let it go, but his attention didn't leave her. He'd recognized something. The question was whether he'd press it or let it sit, the way combat veterans often did, respecting the walls people built to survive. It was at 9:36 a.m. that Dr. Sterling arrived. He came through the unit the way he always did, expensive shoes clicking against linoleum like a metronome counting down to something nobody wanted to hear. Dr. Philip Sterling wore his white coat like it was a weapon, the stitching precise, his stethoscope draped in a way that suggested he'd practiced the angle in a mirror. 48 years old, board-certified cardiologist, 3 failed marriages, and a medical license that had survived 2 complaints filed by nurses who claimed he'd berated them in front of patients. The hospital had paid those settlements quietly, the way hospitals did when they needed problems to disappear. Margaret recognized the type immediately. She'd served under officers like him, men who needed hierarchy the way other people needed air, who saw anyone who might be competent at their job as a threat to the careful architecture of power they'd constructed. He scanned the unit with a kind of clinical assessment that looked like he was checking on patient welfare but was actually checking on territory, seeing where the power lay, where challenges might emerge. His eyes passed over Margaret without catching. She was exactly what he needed to see, a middle-aged nurse in faded scrubs, unremarkable, competent but not threatening, the kind of background fixture that made the foreground of his authority feel legitimate by contrast. That was her safety. That was her shield. Around 10:15 a.m., the unit's attending physician, Dr. Nathaniel Chen, the other Chen, older, more senior, came through on rounds with a group of residents and a clinical pharmacist named Reeves. They stopped at bed 3, where an elderly man was recovering from a catheter placement. Margaret had been monitoring him through the morning, watching his vitals, checking his access sites, noting the way his pain had shifted from sharp to dull around 8:56 a.m., which meant the medication timing was good. "The patient's hemodynamics have been stable since adjustment," Chen said, reviewing the monitor. "Cardiac outputs recovered well. No signs of tamponade." One of the residents, a woman named Dr. Kessler, frowned at the chart. "That's fast." The data from the procedure suggested potential inflammation. Margaret was adjusting the drip in the adjacent bed, close enough to hear, working in that way she had of being present without being seen. Her hands continued their work, smooth and practiced, the kind of efficiency that came from having done the same task 1,000 times in circumstances ranging from air-conditioned offices to military field hospitals where the temperature was 112 degrees and the power was contingent on fuel supplies. "You'd be looking at a pericardiocentesis if that went south," Chen said. "Need someone who understands the anatomy and can handle the procedure under pressure. There's a technique for ultrasound-guided needle placement," Dr. Kessler offered. "But it requires someone with trauma background. Most civilian nurses don't have that kind of experience." Margaret was aware of Torres watching her again. She was aware that she'd made the smallest possible movement, a nod, barely visible, at the mention of pericardiocentesis, the procedure she'd performed dozens of times in circumstances that would never be recorded in the civilian medical system because field medicine in Kandahar didn't appear in academic databases. That was when Dr. Sterling walked up to the group. His presence changed the air pressure in the room the way certain people could do, though Margaret wouldn't have admitted to noticing such a thing. He positioned himself at the edge of the conversation like he was joining something casual, but his body language was territorial, the way it always was when he sensed attention being paid to someone else. "Dr. Chen," Sterling said, his voice carrying the kind of casual superiority that came from knowing he had institutional weight behind him. "The new ICU intake from emergency. Room 4. I'd like to evaluate before we assign a primary nurse." Chen nodded. "Admitted 30 minutes ago. Stable on monitors, but he's requesting updates on his family contacts before we do formal workup." "I'll handle the initial assessment," Sterling said. His eyes moved across the unit, and they caught, just for a microsecond, on Margaret, then slid away without recognition. Get one of the senior nurses on his care. Not the new rotations. Someone experienced. He turned and moved toward room 4, his white coat trailing slightly, his authority moving with him like a thing that had weight. Torres was quiet for a moment after Sterling left. Margaret could feel the question forming in his mind like she could feel weather changes approaching, the way combat-trained people learn to sense shifts in the atmospheric pressure of a room. "That the attending?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral. "Unit Director," Margaret said, checking the fall line. "Handles the administrative side. Patient care goes through Dr. Chen most of the time." Torres nodded, but she could read the calculus happening behind his eyes, the way he was reassessing the power structure, putting pieces together. She'd seen that look before on the faces of younger enlisted personnel who'd just realized their commanding officer was a problem and they were going to have to decide what to do about it. Around 11:38 a.m., Margaret took her lunch break. The break room was empty, which was rare and therefore precious. She sat in one of the 4 uncomfortable chairs scattered around the small space, her lunch container open in front of her, and for the first time that day she let her shoulders drop slightly. The tremor in her left hand was visible now, just a small shake in her fingers where she held her fork, and she waited for it to settle the way it always did after a few minutes of rest. Through the break room's small window, she could see out into the corridor. The hospital moved at its own rhythm, codes called overhead, people rushing, the careful ballet of institutional medicine where everything mattered and nothing could afford to take too long. She'd chosen this life deliberately, 5 years ago, when she'd signed the medical discharge paperwork and walked away from the Navy with enough medication to manage the nightmares if she didn't sleep more than 4 hours at a time. She'd chosen to disappear. She'd chosen quiet. The break room door opened and Jake Torres walked in with his lunch container. He paused when he saw her, then nodded and chose a chair that wasn't adjacent but wasn't hostile either, just nearby, the way combat people sat around each other, companionable and respectful of space. "First week's going okay?" Margaret asked, the kind of neutral question that meant nothing and everything. "It's different," Torres said. He was unwrapping a sandwich. "Quieter than deployment. Less of the urgency. Different kind of medicine." Margaret understood that exactly. The urgency in civilian trauma was different, it was still life and death, but it happened in the context of insurance paperwork and family presence and the knowledge that there was a process, a hierarchy, a chain of command that somebody else was responsible for. In field medicine, you were responsible for everything. That was the part that followed you home. "You'll adjust," Margaret said. It wasn't advice exactly. It was just a statement of fact, delivered in her usual measured way, the way she delivered most things, without inflection, without expectation, without the burden of emotion. Torres was quiet for a moment. "Then, you adjust pretty well yourself. Been here long?" 3 years, Margaret said. He nodded like that confirmed something. "You must have seen a lot. In that time." "Enough," she said. The break room fell silent then, the kind of silence that 2 people with military background could share without awkwardness, the kind of silence that came from understanding that some things didn't need to be said out loud, and some things were better left alone. The door to Mr. Hendrick's room swung open at 9:48 a.m., and Dr. Sterling entered like a man reviewing inventory. The 72-year-old Vietnam veteran sat propped against 3 pillows, his daughter Claire holding his hand, watching Margaret change the dressing on his lower abdomen with a kind of attention that came from genuine care. Margaret's fingers moved with practiced precision, one hand steadying the gauze while the other assessed circulation beneath, checking for warmth, for color, for the 1,000 small signs that told a story words couldn't capture. Sterling stood in the doorway for 30 seconds, observing. His eyes narrowed. "Nurse Walsh," he said, his voice pitched to carry. "That's an outdated method. Did you learn that in the Stone Age?" The room temperature dropped. Margaret took one measured breath, her hand pausing mid-wrap. She didn't look up from the dressing. "The patient's circulation requires gentle assessment before. I didn't ask for a lecture from someone who can barely keep up with modern protocols." Sterling stepped closer, his presence like a weight pressing down on everyone in the room. He gestured dismissively at her hands. That technique went out with bell-bottom scrubs, Walsh. The fact that Mr. Hendricks hasn't developed a hematoma despite your methods is pure luck, not competence. Claire's face flushed crimson. She looked at Margaret with something between pity and horror, as if she'd just witnessed an animal being struck in public. Mr. Hendricks stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, his free hand gripping the bedrail. Margaret finished wrapping the dressing. Tape secured. Done. She straightened, and in that moment, one tear traced a line down her left cheek, not from her eye, but from the inside corner, a single crystalline track that caught the fluorescent light filtering through the window. Her hand rose automatically, and she wiped it away with the back of her palm in one swift motion, her composure reasserting itself like a door closing. She turned to face Sterling directly, and when she spoke, her voice came out like still water, absolutely level, absolutely quiet, the kind of quiet that made people instinctively stop talking just to hear it. Cowards always need an audience, Dr. Sterling. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of something: shock, recognition, the weight of truth spoken aloud in a place where truth had no business being acknowledged. Sterling's face reddened. He opened his mouth, closed it, then pivoted and left without another word, his shoes clicking hard against the tile floor, each step an exclamation mark of rage. Claire looked at Margaret with new eyes. "He shouldn't speak to you that way." "It's fine," Margaret said, already washing her hands at the bedside sink, her movements resuming their ordinary rhythm as if nothing had happened. "Some people need to feel larger than they are. He'll find someone else to measure himself against tomorrow." But that wasn't true, and both of them knew it. Dr. Sterling didn't move on. He collected grievances like a magpie collects shiny objects, turning them over in his mind, planning. That humiliation in front of a patient's daughter, Margaret refusing to break, refusing to fight back, refusing to give him the satisfaction of her defense, it had accomplished the opposite of what he intended. Instead of crushing her, he discovered something harder, a woman who wouldn't crack. By Tuesday, the break room had become a study in social physics. Margaret entered at 1:15 p.m. with her lunch, the same turkey sandwich from the hospital cafeteria she'd been eating all week, the same apple, the same bottle of water, and sat at the long laminate table where 4 nurses were finishing their break. She pulled out a chair. The room's conversation, which had been rolling along like normal machinery, stuttered to a halt mid-sentence. Nurse Patricia gathered her empty container. "I need to check on my patient." She stood, didn't look at Margaret. Nurse Rayner drained her water bottle. "Yeah, I'm heading back." "Long afternoon." She made for the door. 2 others followed within 30 seconds, both with invented reasons, both with carefully neutral faces, all of them leaving in the way people leave when staying means choosing sides. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant tune, the refrigerator's compressor kicked on with a mechanical shudder, and Margaret sat alone at a table built for 12, her turkey sandwich untouched, her hands folded on top of the laminate where everyone could see she wasn't trembling. She didn't eat. She sat for 8 minutes, then disposed of the uneaten lunch in the trash and returned to the unit. The message was understood by everyone. Margaret Walsh had been declared invisible. Not disliked, that would have required engagement. She'd been deleted. By Friday afternoon, the notice appeared on the unit board where shift change announcements and patient census updates were posted. A printed sheet, official looking, with Margaret's name at the top. 12 policy violations, each one itemized with meticulous detail. Expired BLS certification renewal. Improper documentation of fluid intake on patient 4847. Failure to report procedural concerns through proper chain of command. Failure to follow standardized pressure app technique per hospital protocol for .7.2. Outdated assessment methodology. Insubordination. Scope of practice overreach. 3 additional documentation failures on consecutive shifts. 2 more inventory discrepancies. And the final count, unauthorized communication with surgical staff regarding patient care protocols. Sterling had constructed these violations with the precision of a man who'd had experience manufacturing evidence. He'd interviewed techs, reviewed old charts, dug through email records, and everywhere he'd looked, he'd found exactly what he needed, or created it. For the violations didn't exist in any meaningful way. They were interpretations, read through a lens designed to break what he was looking at. But they were written with enough technical language that they sounded real. They sounded damning. Margaret discovered it like everyone else did, by seeing it posted where she couldn't miss it, the paperwork equivalent of being announced to the crowd. Dr. Sterling found her in the hallway outside the medication room at 3:27 p.m. He was alone with her, which meant he'd timed it that way. He held a thicker folder in his right hand, and his smile was the smile of a man who'd finally backed someone into a corner. "Nurse Walsh," he said, "I think we need to talk about your future at Oak Creek Memorial." He extended the folder. Margaret took it without hesitation, without the tremor of fear that would have satisfied him. She held his gaze as she did it, her expression a blank page. One tear fell, just one, traced a path from her left eye down to her jawline, and disappeared into the fabric of her scrub collar. She didn't wipe it this time. She let it sit for 1 second, then 2, and then with a single motion of her thumb, she cleared it away. "Maybe it's time you found work more suited to your capabilities," Sterling said, his voice dripping false sympathy. "Somewhere quieter. Where you won't need to keep up with modern protocols." Margaret opened the folder. Her eye scanned the violations without expression, her jaw tightening almost imperceptibly, the only visible crack in her composure. Then she closed the folder and looked back at Sterling with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse than this. "Is there anything else, Doctor?" she asked, her voice still that flat water-level tone. "That's all," he said, and left her there holding her own professional execution. At 11:19 p.m., in the sterile chaos of Surgical Suite 3, everything changed. A 17-year-old with acute appendicitis, surgery already underway, attending surgeon working methodically through the procedure, and then the attending's hand slipped. Just slightly. Just enough. The scalpel's edge caught the iliac artery, a vessel no one wanted to nick, and blood fountained across the surgical field in a way that made everyone's training lock into overdrive. The attending surgeon froze. His confidence evaporated like water on a hot griddle. For 1 full second, there was nothing but red and the soft beeping of monitors climbing toward dangerous ranges. Margaret moved. She didn't ask. She didn't suggest. Her hands crossed the field and found a clamp, the precise instrument, not the closest one, and she placed it with the kind of accuracy that lived in muscle memory trained through impossible circumstances. Jake Torres watched from across the table, and what he witnessed made his entire understanding of the past 3 years reorganize itself instantaneously. Her movements were economical. No wasted motion. No hesitation. The angle of her approach, the way her fingers positioned themselves, the absolute certainty in how she guided the attending surgeon's hands through the repair, it was battlefield medicine translated to a civilian operating room, and it was unmistakable to anyone who'd seen it before. "You were over there," Jake whispered through his mask, barely audible, but Margaret heard him. He knew she heard him because her jaw tightened, and her eyes met his for exactly 1 second before returning to the surgical field. When they closed 32 minutes later, the patient's vitals were stable. The artery was repaired. The crisis had been averted by hands that had done this before under far worse conditions. Jake followed Margaret to the scrub room and watched her wash her hands with the same meticulous attention she brought to everything. "Kandahar?" he asked quietly. "Helmand." Margaret turned off the water. She didn't look at him. "I'm a civilian nurse in Denver, Jake. That's all." But that wasn't all, and they both knew it. What neither of them knew was that Dr. Sterling had already received word about the appendectomy from a surgical tech who owed him a favor. How Walsh had taken over. How she'd overstepped her role as a nurse. How her presumption had nearly caused a scene in his operating room. Sterling stood in his office at midnight, phone pressed to his ear, speaking to board chairman Mitchell Davis, a man whose son Sterling had once helped remove from a plagiarism investigation that could have destroyed the boy's medical school prospects. Favors like that created leverage. Leverage like that could be called in. "We have a liability issue," Sterling said into the darkness. One that requires discussion at the board level. Her name is Margaret Walsh, and I need her gone before she compromises patient safety again. In her locker, hidden in the lining of a jacket she hadn't worn since leaving the Navy 5 years ago, the patch remained invisible, a faded unit insignia from the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, stitched by her own hands before the nightmares got too loud. She had no idea that the world was about to come looking for her. She had no idea that one name spoken in that operating room would travel upward through channels she'd forgotten existed. She had no idea that the life she'd carefully constructed, Margaret Walsh, quiet nurse, unremarkable, safe, was about to collide with the life she'd been before. All she knew at 2 a.m., sitting in her apartment with the city lights of Denver spread below her like a grid of small truths and small lies, was that she'd wiped blood off her hands and somehow felt closer to herself than she had in 5 years. The cardiac monitor's alarm shrieked through the ICU at 1:53 a.m. like a warning siren that shouldn't exist at that hour, and Margaret was already moving before the second beep registered. The hospital had skeleton staff that night. COVID lockdown protocols meant half the experienced nurses were reassigned, scattered across other rotations like Sterling had specifically orchestrated it, which he had. The admission came through the emergency entrance at 1:48 p.m., a Navy Admiral, 61 years old, transferred from some official function downtown with chest pain radiating down his left arm and a blood pressure that wouldn't stabilize above 94 systolic. Admiral Richard Keating. Margaret had read the name on the chart without any recognition, without any flicker of the past colliding with the present. Just another patient. Just another name on a clipboard in a hospital where she'd spent 3 years becoming nobody. She'd drawn his blood at 1:55 p.m., inserted the 4 into his left arm with a single smooth motion, watched his pupils dilate with the fear that comes when your own body betrays you at 61 and the doctors haven't yet told you what's wrong. His hands trembled as she worked. Hers didn't. She'd explained the EKG, the troponin levels they were running, the fact that cardiology was already being paged despite the hour. Standard admission protocol. Standard reassurance. Standard lies that everything would be fine when neither of them actually knew that. By 2:08 a.m., the monitor told a different story. The alarm's pitch changed, not the regular beep of arrhythmia, but the sustained shriek of acute decline. Margaret was at his bedside before the code button fully activated, her eyes reading the waveform faster than conscious thought could process it. Pressure dropping. Heart rate climbing. The pattern unmistakable to anyone who'd done this under fire, in a tent built from sandbags, with mortar rounds impacting 50 meters away and no cardiology team that could arrive in time because there was no team at all, just hands and knowledge and the bone-deep certainty that the next 60 seconds would determine whether this man lived or died. Cardiac tamponade. Blood filling the pericardial sac like a closed fist tightening around his heart, crushing it with each systole, suffocating the very organ that was supposed to sustain him. Without drainage, the Admiral would go into complete cardiovascular collapse in minutes. Not hours. Not even 1 hour. Minutes. Margaret's voice changed. The soft-spoken nurse with the deferential tone and the habit of stepping back to let actual doctors make decisions, that voice disappeared. What remained was something else. Get me the pericardiocentesis kit. Now. Not a request. A command that made the ER intern move without questioning who was giving it, that made nurses respond as if orders had come from someone who'd actually earned the right to give them. She was reaching for the crash cart when Dr. Sterling appeared in the doorway, still in street clothes, called in from home by his lawyer 30 minutes earlier. His face held the particular expression of a man watching someone operating outside the carefully constructed hierarchy that protected him, and it darkened like a storm moving across open water. Step back, Walsh. His voice had that edge it got when he was threatened, when someone else's competence was making his own mediocrity visible. You do not have authorization for that procedure. That's a physician-level intervention. Margaret didn't look at him. She was prepping the Admiral's chest, wiping antiseptic across the fourth intercostal space in the midclavicular line, her hands moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd done this before. The kit was already open. The 18-gauge needle was already in her gloved fingers. She could feel Sterling's presence, the way his body language had shifted from observant to obstructive, but fear was information, and information had no emotional valence. Information was just data. Data was just input. And the data said this man would die in 2 minutes if she waited for authorization. You do not have authorization for that procedure, Walsh. Step back or I will have security remove your badge tonight. Sterling was moving toward her now, his hand already reaching for his phone, already composing the narrative that would justify what was about to happen. I am ordering you to step back from that patient. Margaret met his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. There was no defiance in her expression, no anger, no visible reaction at all. What she felt and what she showed had diverged 5 years ago in Kandahar, and the gap between them had only widened since. She simply stepped around him, not pushing, not acknowledging his presence beyond the physics of avoiding him, and approached the Admiral's bedside. The Admiral's eyes were half closed, consciousness flickering like a light on a failing circuit. His blood pressure was now 68/41. The monitor showed his heart rate at 142 and climbing, inefficient contractions that were moving less blood with each beat because there was no room for blood to move. Gravity was working against him. Physics was working against him. Only intention and practiced hands could work in his favor. Margaret's breathing steadied into the measured pattern of surgical focus. Palpate the landmarks. Identify the space between the ribs. Needle perpendicular to the chest wall, angled slightly toward the left shoulder to avoid the descending thoracic aorta, to avoid the left main coronary artery, to find instead the thin visceral membrane surrounding the heart and the dark blood that shouldn't be there. She felt the needle slip between the 4th and 5th ribs with the precision of muscle memory so deep it predated conscious thought. 3 centimeters. 4. 5. The give of tissue. The subtle resistance of pericardium. And then the dark blood filling the syringe like surrender. The hiss of pressure releasing. The Admiral's oxygen saturation climbed. 68, 71. 74, his blood pressure began its recovery. 70/42. 74/46. The monitor's tone changed from desperation to something approaching stability. His eyes focused for the first time, meeting Margaret's face as she held the needle in place, as she drew the second syringe of fluid from the pericardial space, as she performed the exact procedure Dr. Sterling had forbidden with the certainty of someone who'd trained in trauma units where there was no choice but to act. Behind her, Sterling's phone was already at his ear. She could hear his voice, tight with rage, arranging his next move before the Admiral's blood pressure had even completed its stabilization. Already calling his lawyer. Already beginning the narrative. Already constructing the framework that would remove her from this hospital before dawn broke. The Admiral's lips moved. Margaret leaned closer, reading his words in the way his mouth shaped them. Vanguard. A single word, spoken like a prayer or a password or a memory surfacing from depths neither of them had expected. His eyes held hers for 3 more seconds, and she felt the moment of recognition cross between them like electricity, dangerous and true. Margaret's hand trembled for the first time in 5 years. Not from fear. From something deeper. From the collision of the woman she'd been, the senior chief petty officer who ran trauma units in Kandahar, who held field hospitals together under siege, who operated in tents when there were no real hospitals at all, with a nurse she'd constructed so carefully here in Denver, all soft-spoken and unremarkable and safely invisible. She steadied her hand. Withdrew the needle. Applied direct pressure to the site. Pressed a gauze pad and tape over the puncture wound with the same precision she'd used to create it, and when she looked up, Sterling was no longer in the room. His voice carried from the hallway, sharp with urgency, speaking to someone named Michael Voss about immediate disciplinary action, about exceeding scope of practice, about a nurse who needed to understand that there were consequences for operating outside the hierarchy. Jake Torres appeared at the bedside then, the young combat medic who'd assisted on the appendectomy 3 nights earlier, and his eyes held what Margaret had learned to hide. Recognition. Respect. The unmistakable knowledge of what he'd just witnessed, not just technical competence, but the kind of seamless battlefield precision that only came from having operated under fire, from having made decisions that couldn't be unmade, from having held people's lives in both hands and refused to let go. "You were over there," he whispered. Not a question. A statement of fact delivered with the reverence of someone who understood exactly what that meant. Margaret met his eyes for one moment, then looked away. "Check his O2 SATs every 5 minutes. Let me know if there's any change." Her voice had returned to its standard register, professional, measured, deferential. The mask back in place. The distinction between what she was and what she showed carefully re-established. "Senior Chief," Jake started, using the rank without thinking, without permission, as if the recognition had already transformed what could be said between them. "Just a nurse," Margaret said quietly, and walked toward the medication room before he could say anything else, before anything else could break through the careful architecture of her concealment. But as she moved through the ICU, she could feel it, the moment when everything changed, when the boundary between before and after became permeable, when 5 years of invisibility began their collapse. She'd saved an admiral's life. She'd done it with battlefield precision that nobody at Oak Creek Memorial was supposed to know she possessed. And somewhere in the next few hours, she suspected, that knowledge would begin to spread like an infection that no antibiotic could treat. In the hallway outside the Admiral's room, Sterling was still on his phone with Michael Voss, still constructing his narrative, still convinced that the hierarchy he'd built could protect him. But Margaret understood something now that she hadn't understood 5 minutes earlier. She understood that some things, once revealed, couldn't be hidden again. Some identities, once recognized, couldn't be concealed behind soft-spoken deference and careful invisibility. The Admiral's eyes had held hers with the weight of shared history, and he'd spoken her unit's call sign like it meant something. Like she was someone. The cardiac monitor's alarm shrieked through the ICU at exactly 2:07 a.m., a sound that cut through the skeleton crew's silence like a surgical blade. Margaret's head lifted from the medication cart where she'd been restocking epinephrine vials, and she moved before conscious thought could catch up, muscle memory taking over, the kind that came from 3 tours and 14 years in active duty field stations. Admiral Richard Keating's monitor showed the pattern immediately: pulses paradoxus, electrical alternans, the unmistakable signature of cardiac tamponade. His chest was filling with blood. He had minutes, not hours. Dr. Sterling was 3 floors down in the residence lounge, his feet propped on a leather ottoman, scrolling through his phone. Margaret didn't wait for a page. She didn't wait for authorization. She moved to the crash cart and grabbed the pericardiocentesis kit with the same fluid precision she'd used in Kandahar when the field hospital's generator had died, and she'd performed the procedure by flashlight with mortars impacting 200 meters away. The kit's metal tray felt familiar in her hands: 18-gauge needle, sterile field drape, cardiac ultrasound probe already warmed and ready from routine use. The Admiral's breathing had turned shallow, his oxygen saturation dropping like a stone: 94, 89, 84. His blood pressure collapsed to 68/41. Jake Torres, the young combat medic who'd been watching her all week with recognition burning in his eyes, stepped back and let her take the lead without question. He knew what he was looking at. He'd seen those hands move before, in a context that terrified him because it meant the quiet nurse he'd been assigned to shadow was something the hospital didn't know it had. Margaret's voice dropped an octave as she spoke, no longer the deferential nurse asking permission, but the senior chief petty officer who'd trained 40 medics in life-saving procedures under fire. "I need the ultrasound probe on his chest, now." Jake, his left hand, keep it steady. It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered with the weight of someone who'd given orders while explosions rattled the tents around her. She palpated the 5th intercostal space, found the midclavicular line by muscle memory and touch, cleaned the skin with chlorhexidine in a circular motion that left a bronze-colored stain. The needle went in at a 45-degree angle, advancing slowly, feeling for the distinct pop of the pericardial sac rupturing under the needle's tip. The hiss of air escaping came next, a sound like a tire deflating, like pressure releasing, like life returning to a dying man's body. Dark blood filled the syringe, clotting and sluggish. 40 milliliters. 50. The Admiral's oxygen saturation climbed as his heart regained space to beat, 86, 91, 94. His blood pressure rose from the basement, 68/41 becoming 82/56, then 94/62, stabilizing into something that could sustain consciousness. His eyes opened, searching the darkness above him, and found Margaret's face leaning over him in the ICU's pale fluorescent glow. "You're stable, sir," she said, her voice steady as surgical steel. "The blood around your heart is gone." The Admiral's hand moved slowly, his grip weak but deliberate, and he gripped her wrist. His eyes held hers for 3 seconds, an eternity in the language of recognition. His lips moved, and he whispered her unit's call sign, the one no civilian should have known, Vanguard. Margaret didn't flinch. She didn't break eye contact. She simply nodded once, acknowledged him with the same military courtesy she'd perfected over 14 years, and continued checking his vitals as if the single word hadn't just torn open the careful invisibility she'd constructed over 5 years of hidden service. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part began at dawn, when Dr. Sterling returned from his overnight sleep with 6 phone calls already loaded in his mind like ammunition. His first call, at 6:43 a.m., went to Board Chairman Robert Davis. "We have a serious liability issue on the ICU," Sterling said, his voice smooth as butter over a serrated blade. "A floor nurse performed an invasive cardiac procedure without physician authorization. She's dangerously unstable, possibly manic, given her impulsive decision-making." His second call, at 6:58 a.m., went directly to HR Director Linda Marsh. "I need to file a formal complaint about Margaret Walsh exceeding her scope of practice. She performed a procedure that could have killed the Admiral. We need immediate investigation." His third call was to his lawyer friend, Thomas Belmont, who specialized in medical licensing terminations and had successfully dismantled 2 nurses' careers in the past 18 months. By 7:15 a.m., Sterling had called the State Board of Nursing with an allegation of unauthorized invasive procedure by an unqualified nurse. By 7:42 a.m., he'd contacted 2 other physicians who owed him favors, both of whom agreed to document concerns about Margaret's erratic decision-making. By 8:36 a.m., a private investigator named Terence Cole had already begun digging into Margaret Walsh's background, specifically looking for psychiatric history, military connections, or anything that could be weaponized into evidence of instability. The institutional machinery Sterling had activated moved with terrifying precision. It wasn't crude. It was surgical. By 9:15 a.m., HR Director Marsh had a manila folder on her desk labeled Walsh, Margaret, Incident Report. By 10:16 a.m., Board Chairman Davis had called an emergency session. By 11:33 a.m., Margaret's hospital badge had been deactivated by security. She was escorted to her locker by a guard whose name she'd never learned, a man who wouldn't meet her eyes as she gathered her belongings. The jacket with the faded unit patch sewn inside its lining stayed behind, draped across the top shelf. Too heavy with memory. Too close to exposure. At 1:52 p.m., Margaret pushed through the glass doors of the Denver VA hospital, the mandatory psychiatric evaluation looming ahead of her like a courtroom. The waiting room was a mirror she didn't want to see reflected back at her. A Marine in a wheelchair, his left leg ending at the thigh, his jaw clenched against phantom pain that still visited him at night. A female Army specialist with burn scars that mapped across her neck and collarbone like a geography of fire. A man who looked close to Margaret's own age, maybe 52, rocking slightly in his chair, his hands trembling with the kind of shaking that didn't come from cold. All of them wore the same look she recognized from 17 years of trauma medicine. They'd seen the worst humanity could deliver, and they'd survived it. Margaret took the intake form from the receptionist, a woman with kind eyes and a name tag that read Susan. The form was standard: emergency contact information, current medications, psychiatric history, substance use screening. Then came the question that stopped her pen mid-motion: have you ever served in the military? The checkbox waited. Empty. Honest. Damning. These were people she would have treated if she'd stayed in uniform. These were Marines she might have led. This was the weight she'd been running from for 5 years, the knowledge that every day she hid in scrubs was a day she wasn't training the next generation of combat medics, wasn't passing forward the techniques that saved lives under fire, wasn't carrying her share of the burden that fell on the healers who worked in zones where death wasn't metaphorical or statistical. It was concrete. It was immediate. It was the cost of trying to save everybody. She checked the box, yes. Meanwhile, in Administrator Helen Dorsey's office on the 5th floor of Oak Creek Memorial, Dr. Sterling stood beside his lawyer, Thomas Belmont, presenting the incident report with the confidence of a man who controlled the narrative. The Admiral arrived at 1:53 a.m. in acute distress, Sterling explained, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd done this before, dismantled careers through institutional process rather than direct confrontation. This nurse, Margaret Walsh, performed a pericardiocentesis without physician authorization. That's a procedure reserved for attending physicians. She's a floor nurse. She exceeded her scope of practice, and worse, she did it during what appears to be a psychiatric crisis, impulsive, reckless decision-making without regard for protocol. HR Director Linda Marsh nodded, writing notes. Board Chairman Davis frowned, reviewing the incident report. Hospital attorney Michael Voss listened with the practiced expression of someone who'd heard variations of this complaint 17 times before. Voss's cell phone rang at 3:12 p.m. He excused himself and took the call in the hallway, his voice dropping to a measured professional tone. The conversation lasted 90 seconds. When he returned to the office, the color had drained from his face like someone had pulled a plug and let his certainty hemorrhage out. "Gentlemen," Voss said slowly, "the Admiral has regained consciousness. He's stable. And he's asking for the nurse by name. He's refusing to speak to anyone else. He wants to know why a decorated senior chief is being investigated for saving his life." Sterling's throat went tight. The lawyer's hand froze mid-pen. In the waiting room of the Denver VA hospital, 2.7 miles away, Margaret Walsh held an intake form asking if she'd ever served, and finally put her name down on the blank line marked "Reason for Evaluation." The reason was simple, and it was devastating, and it was the beginning of everything ending and everything beginning again in the same moment. She was labeled unstable by a man who would have broken under the first whistle of incoming fire. And somewhere in that hospital where she'd tried so desperately to be invisible, an admiral who'd survived her hands was asking for her by name, speaking her unit's call sign to a security team that had no idea what they were protecting. The phone call came through at exactly 3:48 p.m. The phone call came through at exactly 3:06 p.m. Administrator Marcus Dorsey's face drained of color as he listened, his hand gripping the desk phone like it might burn him. The Admiral's voice, still hoarse from the breathing tube but steady as reinforced steel, made one simple demand: why was a decorated senior chief petty officer being investigated for saving his life? 3 minutes later, Dorsey hung up and called his attorney. 8 minutes after that, the hospital's legal team was in full mobilization. The Admiral hadn't made a request. He'd issued a command, and somewhere in his ICU room, he was asking every nurse, every orderly, every resident who passed through his door the same question: where was Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh? The break room fell silent when Officer Ramon Cruz walked in, still wearing his security uniform. He'd been the one who'd escorted Margaret from the building that morning, watching her navigate the exit with the kind of composed dignity that only comes from someone who's already survived worse. He'd held onto the cardboard box containing her personal items, a water bottle with a faded military insignia, 3 photographs of colleagues she never discussed, a challenge coin she didn't know she'd dropped. Now he was walking toward Dr. Sterling's office with a different mission entirely. The doors to the administrative wing hissed open. Security footage would later show Sterling's face when he looked up from his desk, seeing not just Officer Cruz but also hospital administrators, 2 board members, and a woman in navy dress white so crisp and authoritative that the air seemed to press against her. The Admiral's daughter. Commander Sarah Keating, stationed at Naval Base San Diego, had driven north at 140 miles per hour on I-25, her uniform immaculate, her jaw set like granite. She'd received a call from her father's hospital room, and she'd listened to every word of his explanation. What happened next didn't just silence the room. It changed the entire trajectory of what came next. "You suspended Senior Chief Petty Officer Walsh." The question came out like a weapon, not loud, but the kind of quiet that makes everyone in a 50-foot radius stop breathing. Sterling's lawyer stood immediately. "This conversation cannot." "Sit down." Commander Keating didn't raise her voice. The lawyer Saturday. The room understood that rank had just walked through the door, and it wasn't anyone in civilian clothes. Down in medical records, a trauma nurse named Dr. Lisa Chen, who deployed to Aleppo in 2016, was holding Margaret's service file with trembling hands. The file had been sealed, classified, buried under institutional layers that most civilian hospitals never even knew existed. Her fingers traced the entries. Bronze Star for Valor under fire. Bronze Star for leadership during a mass casualty event. Bronze Star for coordinating a field hospital that treated 847 patients in 14 days while under active siege. And then, at the bottom of the commendations page, 3 words that made her sit down hard in her chair: a Navy Cross. The Navy Cross. The second highest military decoration. Given for extraordinary heroism in combat. Chen walked directly to the conference room where Sterling's disaster was unfolding. Behind her came Gunnery Sergeant David Holloway, a SEAL team leader who'd coordinated with Margaret's unit during a joint operation in Kandahar province in 2017. Holloway moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd spent 2 decades operating in the darkest corners of the world, and when he spoke to the assembled hospital board, his voice carried the weight of men who don't survive, and survivors who do. "She held a field hospital for 14 hours under siege," Holloway said. The words fell like hammer strikes on concrete. Enemy fire from 3 directions. No reinforcements for 8 hours. She rotated 3 surgical teams through exhaustion management, triaged incoming wounded with a 96% survival rate, and when the final mortar round came through the roof, she kept operating with blood on her scrubs and part of the ceiling on the floor. He paused. His eyes found Sterling. The Navy Marine Corps Medal. 2 Purple Hearts. Combat Action Ribbon. That woman saved lives you couldn't count if you spent a year trying. The silence was absolute. The fluorescent light seemed to buzz louder in that emptiness. A Navy Public Affairs officer arrived at 4:23 p.m., carrying a leather portfolio sealed with official documentation. Not just Margaret's service record, but the declassified sections of her work, operational summaries, intelligence briefings, performance reviews from commanding officers with names still classified but signatures that meant something to people who understood the military's strictest protocols. The officer, a Commander Janet Rivera, opened the file and began reading, her voice mechanical and precise, the kind of voice that people use when they're documenting something that doesn't have room for emotion. Dr. Sterling's face had gone the color of old marble. His lawyer had stopped writing notes. By the time Rivera read the line about Margaret's direct citation for saving the lives of 47 wounded Marines in a single 72-hour rotation, Sterling's lawyer had quietly begun packing his briefcase. The sound of the clasps clicking shut was the only noise in the room besides Rivera's clinical recitation of heroism. By 4:51 p.m., Officer Ramon Cruz walked into Sterling's office carrying a cardboard box. It contained his desk belongings, a pen set, a photograph of his ex-wife, a coffee mug that said "World's Best Surgeon" in ironic lettering that probably hadn't seemed ironic when he'd opened it. Cruz set the box down with the gentleness of someone handling something fragile, then straightened, his voice neutral but his eyes cold as a winter garage. "I believe you know the way out." It wasn't a request. It was the kind of statement that security officers use when the situation has moved beyond institutional politeness. Sterling stood. His hands trembled. He picked up the box. His lawyer followed him toward the door, and as they passed Gunnery Sergeant Holloway, Holloway didn't move, but the geometry of his presence made the hallway feel narrower. Sterling had to navigate around him like a small animal moving past a predator that wasn't quite hungry enough to attack yet. The institutional machinery of accountability moved with stunning speed after that. By 5:38 p.m., Sterling's medical privileges were suspended pending investigation. Board Chairman Davis, the very man Sterling thought he'd cultivated into loyalty with 3 years of strategic dinners and shared complaints about declining professional standards, made a statement to HR that felt like a blade between the ribs. The board was not aware of Dr. Sterling's personal vendetta or his systematic misuse of institutional processes to target a highly qualified nurse. He didn't say, "I was fooled." He didn't need to. The subtext was loud enough to echo through the entire hospital. By day 3, Sterling's lawyer stopped returning calls. The state medical board opened an inquiry into the falsified disciplinary reports. 5 nurses came forward with stories of Sterling's pattern of retaliation against competent staff who'd made him feel inadequate. The surgical tech from the emergency appendectomy told investigators about Sterling's interference with Jake Torres' work, about the way he'd tried to sabotage a procedure to protect his own ego. 2 former patients filed formal complaints. The hospital's attorney discovered that Sterling's calls to board members and his hired private investigator constituted harassment and possibly obstruction of medical care, the kind of charges that don't just end careers, they eviscerate them. Margaret's badge was reactivated at 9:15 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. The notification came with a formal apology from hospital leadership and a message from Admiral Keating himself, "Grateful for your service." Then. Now. Always. Her back pay was processed within hours. The Admiral personally requested her involvement in his follow-up care, which meant Margaret now had clinical authority alongside physicians who'd been trying to destroy her 48 hours earlier. The psychology of that reversal, the way power had shifted with the speed of light, wasn't lost on anyone walking those corridors. In the break room that afternoon, Margaret sat with colleagues who were now treating her like something precious that had almost been broken. Jake Torres found her at the table, his young face bright with a kind of reverence that made her uncomfortable. He sat down without asking, a gesture of familiarity that wouldn't have been possible 3 days ago. "I deployed with guys from Scorpion," he said quietly. "They still talk about you." Margaret didn't respond immediately. She sipped her coffee, the cup warm against her steady hands. When she finally spoke, her voice had dropped an octave from the deferential murmur she'd used for 3 years. "How many?" "How many what?" "How many you lost?" Jake's jaw tightened. 12. "In my rotation." Margaret nodded once. She did everything she could. Jake understood that she was talking about herself in third person. It was a technique she used sometimes, a way of creating distance from her own survival, as if the woman who'd held the hospital together was someone else entirely, someone braver, someone who didn't carry the weight of the ones she couldn't save. But in this moment, in this break room where colleagues now saved her a seat and smiled when she arrived, that distance was closing. The mask she'd spent 3 years building was becoming transparent. Within 2 weeks, no hospital in the Denver health system would credential Dr. Sterling. His malpractice insurance dropped him. His lawyer friend, the one he'd called about Margaret's licensing, the one who specialized in medical board hearings, stopped taking meetings. The institutional machinery that had once protected him had recognized him as a liability and excised him with surgical precision. By late March, he was selling supplemental insurance from a folding table at a strip mall off Colfax Avenue, the kind of fluorescent-lit corridor where dreams go to die beneath humming lights and the smell of old carpet and desperation. 6 months later, Margaret stood in her Navy dress uniform in a lecture hall at Naval Medical Training Center in San Diego. 200 combat medics filled the seats, their faces young and haunted and determined in equal measure. The faded Kandahar unit patch, the one she'd kept sewn inside her civilian jacket's lining for 5 years, the one Officer Cruz had found in the parking lot and quietly returned to her, now hung properly on her shoulder alongside her decorations. Bronze Star. Bronze Star. Bronze Star. Navy Cross. Purple Heart. Purple Heart. The medals caught the light when she moved, and when she spoke, her voice filled the room like something that couldn't be contained. Pain is data, she was telling them. In the field, in the chaos, when everything is screaming at you to panic, you remember that pain tells you where to look. Not where to feel bad. Where to work. Where to save. She paused. Her hands moved as she demonstrated technique, hands that had held lives together in sandstorms and hospital corridors alike. And sometimes the person screaming the loudest is the person who needs the least intervention. Trauma is as much psychology as it is biology. Your job is to hear what the body is telling you beneath the noise. Jake Torres sat in the front row, enrolled now in the Navy's physician assistant program, his future mapped toward the kind of medicine that matters. Commander Keating watched from a side seat, pride in her bearing. The Admiral stood in the back, recovered, his chest bearing the thin scar of Margaret's needle, his life extending into a future that wouldn't have existed without her hands moving at exactly the right moment. During the break, another instructor mentioned seeing Sterling the previous week at a commercial insurance office downtown. Didn't look up when I passed. Just kept typing something into a computer that looked older than I am. Margaret nodded once, feeling nothing, not satisfaction, not pity, not anger. The emotion that had driven Sterling, the desperate need to protect his fragile ego, had been burned away by the simple weight of truth. She'd expected to feel something at the news of his fall. But revenge, she'd learned a long time ago, was a kind of debt, and she'd stopped keeping accounts. That evening, she had dinner with her sister for the first time in 5 years. Her sister, who'd been texting without answer, calling without response, who'd never known what city Margaret lived in or why she'd vanished. Over pasta in a restaurant with warm lighting and the smell of garlic and basil, Margaret answered questions about where she'd been, what she'd survived, what comes next. The nightmares hadn't disappeared, but they'd quieted. She was sleeping more than 3 hours a night. She was remembering what laughter felt like. She returned to Oak Creek Memorial part-time, working with veteran patients in a special consultation role the hospital had created specifically for her, a position that acknowledged what everyone now understood: some people don't just work in hospitals. They change them. On her first shift back, a young Marine with a shattered femur recognized her name from deployment stories. He asked if the legend was true. Did she really hold a hospital under siege for 14 hours? Margaret adjusted his fall with steady hands. The needle went in with precision that came from thousands of hours of practice, muscle memory written into bone. I did my job, she said quietly. Same as you did yours. We don't call that legend. We call that showing up. As she walked through the corridor past the break room where colleagues now saved her a seat, past the unit board where her name appeared on the commendation list in the hospital's official records, past the nurses' station where everyone looked up and acknowledged her with nods of genuine respect, she thought about a truth that had taken her 5 years of hiding to fully understand. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If you've been underestimated by someone in power who didn't know your true value, if you've ever wanted to see someone's arrogance crumble when they finally understood who they'd been dismissing, subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell. In the comments below, tell us what you would have done in Margaret's position. Would you have walked away? Or would you have saved him anyway?